Good morning, everyone. Well, it looks like this method of trying to use a spore syringe directly on the agar isn't going to work. I got these 4 dishes that I made up the other day, and already in the streaked area, it created bacterial contamination again. So what I have to do, not only thinning the spores, which I'm going to do with an inoculation loop today, and I've already done a couple dishes this way a few days ago, but I haven't done some other factors to make them work better. I have to make conditions a bit better for the mycelium and a bit worse for bacteria, which means I have to get a lot of this condensation you see out of the jar, or out of the dish rather. And that too, using a spore syringe, you're adding water to the dish too, so any standing water in a dish will give it a little bit of an edge to the bacteria because they like, overly wet conditions. So to get the condensation out of these dishes, what I have to do is first get the temperature up in my lab room, which now I have it up past 70 degrees with the space heater, and somewhere between 70 and 75 is really where you should be keeping the lab room up when you have cultures in bags. And I'm going to let this agar that I make the dishes with cool down for about another hour before I open up the pressure cooker. And giving a little bit extra time for the agar to cool will make it not so steamy when I put it into the dish, because it's the steam that gives rise to the condensation on the agar itself and around the dish. So get the agar in there, right temperature, where it's gelled up but not fully gelled that I can't pour it, so you have to monitor it a little bit better, and that will give a much better grow environment for our spores to hatch. Notice too that I dropped that one dish trying to get it out of the bag, which is kind of embarrassing, but to solve that problem, now I'm wrapping my dishes in a sheet of foil. That'll make it easier to get out of the bag. And then you gotta do is peel the foil down and slide the whole thing off the foil. A lot easier, less cumbersome. Also, I have this shot glass, or you can use any small glass. I'm going to sterilize to put some spores in it, and then use the inoculation loop to grab a few. Just wrap it in foil and put it in your pressure cooker with everything else. So you see I have everything set up, ready to go. I'm just waiting for this jar of agar to cool down some. I waited about an hour and a half after I turned the heat off to the pressure cooker. And you could wait actually even longer than that, but I'm trying to get things done a little bit faster. If I take one of these infrared temperature reading tools and I target it on the jar, it gives me a temperature of about 132 degrees Fahrenheit. So that'll give you an idea of how hot the jar is when it comes out. A good rule of thumb to figure out when it's appropriate to pour the agar is, obviously it's still gelled and liquid, but if you can grab a hold of the jar and keep your hand on it for about 30 seconds without it getting too hot, it should be pretty cooled off, ready to go. Okay, you want it warm but not hot, and it might take you a time or two to figure out when the jar cools down enough that it's not going to gel the agar. And even if your agar does gel, you don't have to throw it out. Just re-pressure cook it again, and it will melt the agar up, and then you can reuse it. As long as you don't over caramelize the agar, you don't want it to turn into like a dark brown. You want it to keep that kind of a fleshy tone and color. So as long as you don't overcook it, you can save it. So it's probably going to be about another 10-20 minutes before this is cool enough. Being in front of the float hood is going to cool it off fast. So I'm going to wait every 10 minutes to come back out here, check the jar, see if it's cooled down, give it a swirl, make sure it's still thin. And then once it's cooled down enough, we'll start inoculating some of these dishes again. Alright, looks like we're ready to go. If I use the same infrared reading tool and I aim it at the side of the jar, it gives me a reading of 115 degrees. If I kind of aim it on the inside, hitting the agar, I get a temperature of 105 degrees. I checked online, the actual temperature at which agar gels is anywhere between 90 and 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So I get down to about 105 degrees Fahrenheit. You figure you're probably ready. So I'm going to go ahead, give this another swirl. I can also feel it too, and it's just warm. And when you swirl it, I can see it kind of hang up on the sides just a tiny, tiny bit. Like it's a little bit of a gel. So, the thing I'll do is get these dishes off this foil. See that? That was considerably easier. I'll save that foil for some other application in the future. I have a total of 8 dishes I'm going to be making because I'm going to need a lot, because I don't know if I really need to spread them thin, and even if I do, I might still have some bacteria in there that I'm going to have to select the good mycelium away from the bacteria and transfer it to a new dish to clean the culture up. Now perhaps it was because I did this all in my basement where I grow these that I got a higher amount of bacterial count in with the spores. I wouldn't think that would be any worse than upstairs since I have carpet and all that, you know, a regular house environment. So most likely it's just because of the high density of the spores. But if I had made the spore prints in this lab, you know, like one mushroom at a time, not enough spores to make a mess in here, I probably would have had better results. But again, ideally, you really should be using the route with the inoculation loop for some guaranteed results. The only reason I did it with the syringes at first is because I thought I would be able to get away with it. I guess not. I've done it that way before with other oyster mushrooms. I'm pretty sure I've done that with king oyster mushroom spores too. So I know that way can work, but if it's too wet, there's really nothing you can do about the high bacteria count, or any bacterial count if it's too wet. So I'm going to fill these dishes up. Same manner. I'm going to switch this to the other side. See if I get any steam off the dish. I've also doubled my recipe because I'm making twice as many lids. I don't know if you can tell, but I still get a tiny amount of steam on the top of this lid. Now, of course, I can always reopen the dish and that steam will evaporate out a little bit, but ideally you don't want to be opening the dish for any length of time. So, just a tiny bit, still too warm. Okay, that didn't steam up. Well, it's slowly steaming up now, so it's still liquid enough I can play around with this. I'm gonna let it cool down for another 5 minutes, and then I think that'll be enough that when I pour this next dish, there won't be any steam on the top of the dish. All right, 5 minutes later, and with gloves on, when I put my hand on the jar, it just feels barely warm now. And I can see inside it that it's coating the inside of the jar pretty well. So let's try another dish. That's a little too full now. And still some light condensation. Might need to cool it off just a tiny bit more. Doesn't help that I poured a whole lot into that dish too. Yeah, that's a bit better. Just a light amount of steam. Probably a small amount. It's not going to be enough to cause any water droplets. Try to swirl it around, cool it off just a tiny bit. I can see it actually sticking to the inside of the jar, so can't really cool it off much more than that. Otherwise I'm going to lose some. I think that'll be good enough though. You actually see where it's starting to cling to the lip of the jar too. I'll just go ahead and give it a quarter turn. Get these right on there. Also, too, something to think about is if you've recently cleaned your dishes out, make sure you dry the insides of your dishes or let them air dry, because you can get extra water in there too if you haven't done that. Kind of a big, kind of like blob fell to that one. You can see where it's almost so gelled. I'm probably not going to get barely enough to get this last dish. And you can see it's gelled, so can't get it any cooler than that. Didn't get enough agar to go to the edge of the dish, but I can still use that one. The streak spores across. Yeah, so the first dish I made just has a light bit of fog on the top, but no drips. So that should be pretty good. I'm gonna give those all about a half an hour to completely cool down to where I can inoculate them, and then the agar will firm up completely then. And then we'll get into using a inoculation loop to spread out some spores very thinly. You can see I have my alcohol lamp going. Clean this syringe up just a tiny bit. I chose one of the syringes of spores that didn't have a whole lot caked up in the bottom of it. Try to thin it out even more so. Give it a mix. Still very cloudy in there with the spores. I'm going to take my shot glass that I have wrapped up. And I'm going to sterilize the end of this syringe like I normally would. Cool off a little bit. Drops out, then just a tiny amount in the bottom of that shot glass. You really only need a drop or two. That's that to the side. I'm going to go ahead and put my lamp out since I don't need it for any other purpose. Alright, so I can stack some of these out of the way. We got some more room. You always want some sort of system to make sure you're not skipping dishes or double inoculating dishes, although you can easily see once you streak through the agar whether or not you already inoculated. Actually, no, what am I thinking? I still need that lamp. I gotta sterilize inoculation loop. Well, I definitely need to add more alcohol to this. I don't know what I was thinking. Obviously was not. A little bit of a dry off. Remember to always respect fire. Make sure any excess alcohol is evaporated off of there before you cause a disaster. Alright. Start off with this first dish over here. Now, you can tell, you can still see there's some light condensation on the dish. And I do see some light condensation on the agar itself. Hopefully as it sits in the warm room, because this section of the room, because I have it, you know, boarded off with plastic, doesn't get as warm, so hopefully once the surrounding air is warmed up, all that condensation is going to dissipate. But I think it's low enough levels now that it's not going to be an issue. So I have my inoculation loop. I'm going to give it a clean up. The alcohol dry off. And I'm going to heat the end of the loop until it gets red hot. It's important to get red hot because that'll be hot enough to kill any bacterial spores on it. So keep it in the blue part of the flame, and then let it cool off. You can also dip it in the fresh agar dish to cool it off faster, like so. Just some of the wetness off the top of that. And then I'm just going to touch it to the liquid. I don't want any excess liquid on there. See, I had kind of like an oil dipstick of a car. I could see some water trapped in the loop. Go ahead and just knock it off. You just want the tiniest amount. I'm going to repeat the procedure. Heating up the loop till it's red hot. Touch it, make sure there's no excess water hanging on there, and then streak it. I'm doing a zigzag pattern with these first few dishes, making sure that I'm not overlapping any line, because we want everything to be thinned out as much as possible. Remember, no circular patterns, no patterns in one area. You want lines of mycelium to pop up. It's amazing how few spores are required to get us started. How many spores are actually in a syringe. I'm sure the number is in the trillions, but it only takes 2 spores to get a culture going. Two spores form together, form a dikaryotic mycelium that can reproduce. Spores are haploid. When they form together, they become diploid. Alright, these next 4 I'm just going to do a simple 1 streak across. you never know if you might need extra area on the dish to get some leading mycelium away from the bacteria or mold mycelium. So you don't want to streak up the entire thing. You only want one area have a streak at a time. If this were a spore print, it would be the same procedure of heating the loop, letting it cool off in the air in the agar, and then touching the loop to the spore print. No dragging it through the print, no trying to get more spores on it. All you gotta do is touch it, and it'll be enough to grab the right amount of spores. And when you make your own spore syringes, the classic method is actually using an inoculation loop to grab a small amount of spores they can still visibly see on the loop from a spore print, and then dipping that into a shot glass of sterilized water and swirling it around and sucking it back up into a syringe. Only one streak of that one, but I got it.